All right, we're sharing with you now on the screen behind me what it is that the Prime Minister has tweeted out ahead of the G20. He said, India also places great emphasis on a human-centric way of furthering progress. It is important to emulate Gandhiji's mission of serving the underprivileged, the very last person in the queue. Remember, this actually harks back to something we've heard the Prime Minister and the various officials that are in charge of coordinating India's G20 efforts say multiple times that India wants a human-centric, not an GDP-centered approach to the G20. My colleague Abhishek joins us right now to bring us more context. Abhishek, can you just tell our audiences, because this is a statement we have heard a few times in the run-up to the G20, that India emphasizes a human-centric approach, not a GDP-centric approach. I want to ask you, to some degree, isn't there an inherent contradiction in this? Because the G20 is, after all, a grouping of the world's most powerful economies. How does the Prime Minister want to push through, then, a human-centric approach?
Clearly, when we talk about G20, it has a hold of 75% of world GDP and about 85% of the overall trade that happens within the grouping, and only 60% population of the world resides in G20 countries. There comes the Prime Minister's role, who has been trying to steer this whole global South debate into the G20 elite club. When we had in the month of January Voice of Global South event happening, where world leaders from across the world, about 110 of them, they participated and they discussed about the issues that concerns them. We know that developing world has different priorities. They may talk about climate change in a way that that is not similar to the climate change that is impacting small island nations in Indian Ocean or the Pacific Island. So clearly the priorities are different among the world. But then the common goodness, how can we achieve that? That has been India's target. And Prime Minister Modi, recently, he has said multiple times that this is not going to be a GDP-oriented club that will just think about the GDP and how to enhance the income. But it should also include the human-centric approach, how the climate change is impacting, how the poverty elevation is necessary, how the equitable justice across the society is essential, how the role of women should be enhanced across the society around the globe, how the smaller countries who do not have sufficient power or sufficient finances to ensure their energy transition, they are supported with, how the technologies of the developed world needs to be shared with the smaller countries, which otherwise will take years to transit to the developing stages. So these are the issues that India has been pioneering of: sharing technologies, sharing finances, sharing ideas, sharing your new and emerging technologies like cyber security and other security aspect also, which these smaller countries do face, but they don't have enough means to tackle them. For example, if we talk about smaller island countries in the Indo-Pacific region, there are issues of smuggling, there are issues of human trafficking, narcotics. These countries cannot only have check on these issues, and they need bigger power to come forward and ensure the regional stability and security in those regions. At the same time, not compromising their sovereignty or their own stature as whatever in a way the countries are. So this is where the role of Global South has been enhanced by the Prime Minister Modi. And you were just talking about how Prime Minister Modi has been talking about Mahatma Gandhi, and he's been reciting him. Just behind me is a small booth that explains Khadi, where we could see Prime Minister Modi's picture spinning these cotton and creating thread. And he has been, we have seen so many pictures, and so many times Prime Minister Modi has taken world leaders to Sabarmati Ashram to showcase the legacy of India, India's ideology, and how Mahatma Gandhi has been essentially the part of Indian thought process, Indian policy. And still, even after 75 years of independence, every policy that the government is trying to do, in the center of it is the marginalized people who do not have advantage of being urban or city-centric. So the development goal that India wants for its entire nation is something that India wants also to be discussed at the world level when the G20 leaders will be meeting here. This elite club should also include the crises, the problems, the challenges and concerns of the global South, which are very smaller countries, island nation, maybe population of 1 lakh, 10 lakh people, but they do have problems, they do have existential crisis, and that needs to be discussed, that needs to be deliberated upon at G20. This is what the motto of Prime Minister Modi has been during this upcoming G20 summit talks.
Abhishek, thank you for summarizing that for us. Let's go over now to my colleague Akanksha to understand more. Akanksha is joining us from inside the Bharat Mandapam also. Remember, the Bharat Mandapam is the structure, the conference structure at which all of the meetings are going to be taking place between tomorrow and day after. Let's go to Akanksha to understand more. Akanksha, we've been telling our audiences that if you just take a look at the Prime Minister's agenda for today, there are 3 sets of bilaterals. So there's the bilateral with the leadership of the United States, the leadership of Bangladesh and Mauritius. Can you tell our audiences about India's priorities at each?
Well, if you look at these 3 bilaterals, I think the message is very clear. Something that was also highlighted that the MEA's press briefing as well, Toya, because India's G20 presidency is primarily all about bridging the gap between the global south and the global north. And if you look at these 3 bilaterals that are taking place, primarily of Prime Minister Modi's with President Biden, the key sticking point is going to be about reinventing the G20 narrative, and that is going to be about bridging that gap between global south and global north, because if you look at the other 2 nations, that's namely Bangladesh and then you have Mauritius. So that's how Prime Minister Modi wants to send a more inclusive, a more diverse message by including all countries from global south and the global north, because if you look at it, till yesterday, there was a lot of chatter about Prime Minister Modi's bilateral with President of the United States, Joe Biden. But now, as we are also learning of these 2 other bilaterals that are going to take place, the message is very clear that for Prime Minister, it's all about bringing the industrialized economies to help the emerging nations or the nations of the global south. And that is something which we will be witnessing tonight as those bilaterals happen.
I want to ask you a follow-up question, Akanksha. A lot of foreign media, when it comes to their coverage of G20, they've speculated at the fact that the Russian leadership is not attending. With one news outlet, for example, going so far as to say, is India breaking up with Russia? They're arguing that in Prime Minister Modi and Biden meeting today, I think for the second time in just 3 months, there's clearly a closening of India to the West that we're seeing. Would you agree with that opinion, that take?
You know, we'll have to wait and watch how that actually emerges. The meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, happens. He's, remember, he's a very refined orator. And as far as Russian presence is concerned, you know, Russia is going to be represented by the Russian Foreign Minister. China is going to be represented by Li Qiang, the Premier. So having said that, yes, there's a lot of talk about how the leadership of both the nations are not going to be there. And is the US president going to be at an advantage, considering China and Russia will not be present? But having said that, even though these 2 heads of state, whether it's Putin or Xi Jinping, they may not be present, the fact of the matter is that the countries are being represented by senior leaders at the G20. And how India sort of walks that tricky diplomatic rope is going to be something we'll have to wait and watch. But US is going to be one key big bilateral, because remember, the United States is also going to be playing a very huge role when it comes to promoting digital infrastructure, when it comes to addressing multilateral global banking. We've already seen what Charles Michel has had to say. He's also lauded India's efforts to sort of unify the global infrastructure when it comes to digital banking as well, something that's also been showcased at the Bharat Mandapam, Toya.
Okay, thank you, Akanksha. We'll actually come back to you to get more in terms of input. We'll come back to you in a second.